Hi, this is Andrew. Today I wanted to talk to you again about China's financing of developing countries. The question you might ask is, why is Nehemiah Reset concerned about China's financing of developing countries? Well, the short version is that China is engaged in suppressing its own citizens, but in the last several of years, it has been engaged in financing activities that ultimately have enabled it to suppress other countries as well, including the United States. This video is the second in a series of videos about China's financing techniques and their impact on foreign countries and how it is being used by China to gain control over key resources in various countries, including electrical grids, dams, and natural resources. In this video, we will be discussing the Angola model and how this was used as a model to develop their financing program in Africa. China's engagement in Africa in the contemporary era began around the mid-2000s as an outgrowth of Beijing's Go-Out policy that started to ramp up during President Hu Jintao's administration. The Chinese economy then was rapidly expanding, but Beijing also wanted to increase the country's international exposure and open new markets for its state-owned enterprises that had tremendous excess capacity, particularly in the steel sector. But Chinese firms back then had very little experience operating internationally and often encountered expensive regulatory obstacles in markets like the US, Europe, and some Asian countries. Africa, by contrast, had very low barriers to entry and presented the ideal market for these state-owned enterprises to take some of their first steps overseas. But there was one very big problem: African countries were poor. Too poor to buy most of what these Chinese state-owned enterprises had to sell. To resolve this issue, Chinese officials looked back to their own history in the 1970s for some inspiration. Back then China was desperately underdeveloped, much poorer in fact than most African countries, but had an abundance of natural resources, namely minerals and oil, that were desired by Japan, whose rapidly industrializing economy needed vast amounts of natural resources. But China, given that it was so poor back then, had no way to get these resources out of the ground and to sell them to the Japanese. So the Japanese and Chinese came up with this innovative plan that would allow Japan to extract those raw materials, and rather than pay for it in cash, the Japanese government would instead build roads, bridges, and other infrastructure in China. Fast forward now to the mid-2000s, when the Chinese identified Angola as a potentially major supplier of oil. But back then, Angola was in horrific shape following a brutal decades-long civil war that ended the country, then was littered with landmines, destroyed roads, and very little functioning infrastructure. So China's huge state-owned construction companies saw a giant opportunity. "We'll help you rebuild your country and you won't have to pay a thing. Instead, we'll set a price for all the infrastructure we're going to provide, and then you can pay us back with oil rather than cash." $2 billion later, the so-called Angola model was born. At first, things were great. Everyone seemed happy. Angola's increasingly democratic politicians, still plagued by corruption though, liked the idea of delivering new roads, hospitals, and housing to constituents, while the Chinese were thrilled about the prospect of diversifying their oil supply. But over the years, two key problems emerged that really fundamentally undermined this new development financing model in Africa. First, Angola was selling so much oil to the Chinese in exchange for infrastructure that it wasn't selling it for cash on the open market. Since Angola doesn't really sell much else, it wasn't able to generate enough actual money to circulate in the economy, and that triggered a massive spike in inflation. Second, as part of the deal between the Chinese and Angolans, they fixed the price of oil. Now that works in Angola's favor when oil prices are high, say around $100 a barrel, but not so much when a financial crash comes like the one in 2008 and the price of oil collapsed by half. The Angolans, bound by a contract, are forced to borrow money to make up the difference to repay the Chinese for the $2 billion of infrastructure that was in the initial agreement. Now, we have the making of a burgeoning debt problem. By the mid-2010s, the Angola model had spread across Africa as part of the Chinese building boom that is still underway today. But stakeholders on both sides of these deals have become increasingly nervous about the viability of this kind of barter arrangement. Projects were being built that didn't always make a lot of sense. The Chinese were no longer as dependent on African resources as their Belt and Road Initiative took shape. Additionally, across Africa, concerns mounted about the long-term financial implications of this arrangement. One insider with first-hand negotiating experience said that everyone knew there was a problem but didn't know how to solve it. The urgency to find a new financing mechanism intensified when the U.S. government, then led by President Barack Obama, started to accuse the Chinese of engaging in a form of predatory lending in Africa. At first, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's warnings were largely dismissed by Beijing officials as just another manifestation of China bashing. But the U.S. charge never relented, even after Obama left office and a new American administration took over. Although President Donald Trump seemed to personally admire his Chinese counterpart, Xi Jinping, his administration firmly regards the Chinese government as a strategic rival and fully embraced the debt trap messaging, not just in Africa but around the world. China uses so-called debt diplomacy to expand its influence. Today, that country is offering hundreds of billions of dollars in infrastructure loans to governments from Asia to Africa to Europe to even Latin America. Yet the terms of those loans are opaque at best, and the benefits flow overwhelmingly to Beijing. According to then Vice President Mike Pence, the U.S. has been so effective at labeling the Chinese as predatory lenders that it's now taken as a given by a large number of reporters, scholars, and analysts, and also evolved into a popular, enduring meme on social media. The U.S. efforts to brand the Chinese financing model as a debt trap has been extraordinarily effective, and one that Beijing has, so far, been unable to shake off. In our next video in this series, we will discuss a new financing model that China has been using and what some of the issues are. In the meantime, our leaders need to be more aware of how China's financing methods are being used to allow China to take a major foothold in many of the developing countries. It is being used to secure natural resources for long-term gain as well as control countries through projects such as transportation route financing and financing of mines and dams. China is doing this to gain control of countries without sending troops to secure the populace. Hopefully, our leaders will wake up before it is too late and we find that China has most of our allies under its thumb. Russia is using a similar technique in Europe by selling oil and natural gas to countries like Germany. Our new president, Joe Biden, opened up this opportunity shortly after he took office. It won't be long before Russia has control over Germany and Germany will no longer be an effective member of NATO. Watch our next video in this series by going to Nehemiah Reset's website at nehemiahreset.org to learn about the new financing model that China is implementing to secure control over more countries.